I stepped off the transport helicopter expecting the same rhythm of deployment life, the same routines, the same complaints about food and heat, the same countdown of days until rotation home. My first tour had been straightforward enough, mostly convoy escorts and checkpoint duty near Kabul. Standard stuff that barely registered as noteworthy in my letters back to Colorado. Forward operating base. Kandahar East looked different from the moment I hit the ground. The helicopter pilot had mentioned it was 30 miles out from the main city, tucked into terrain that made most maps look generous. What he hadn't mentioned was the thing sitting dead center of the compound. The stone structure rose maybe 40 feet above the rest of the base, built from blocks that looked like they'd been carved by hand centuries ago. A medieval keep, complete with narrow window slits and weathered battlements. The damn thing belonged in a history textbook, not surrounded by Humvees and generator sheds. I grabbed my duffel and followed the other new arrivals toward what looked like the administration building. The base spread out around the keep in a rough circle, with modern military facilities positioned at careful distances from the very old walls. Prefab buildings, communications towers, motor pools, all the usual infrastructure of a forward operating base, just arranged like someone was afraid to get too close to the centerpiece. The soldiers already stationed here moved differently than what I remembered from my first deployment. They walked with their heads down, conversations kept to whispers, and nobody seemed to make eye contact for more than a second or two. When I passed a group near the mess tent, their discussion stopped completely until I was out of hearing. Sergeant Michael Torres met us at the command post, a weathered guy with the kind of permanent squint that came from too many years in harsh sunlight. His uniform was crisp despite the heat, and he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who'd been in command positions for a while. He processed our paperwork with efficient silence, assigning bunks and duty rotations without the usual small talk. "What's the story with the castle?" I asked when he handed me my assignment sheet. Torres glanced up from his clipboard, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of wariness that made me wish I'd kept the question to myself. "That structure is off limits to all personnel," he said. "No exceptions, no questions. Clear? Clear, Sergeant?" He held my attention for another few seconds, like he was making sure the message had really red-landed. "You'll get a full briefing on base protocols tomorrow. Right now, get settled and stay put until chow." The conversation ended there, but Torres kept watching me as I collected my gear and headed toward the barracks. I'd asked a simple question about an obvious landmark, and he'd responded like I'd inquired about classified intelligence. The whole exchange left me feeling like I'd already stepped wrong on my first day. My assigned bunk was in a building that faced away from the keep, which felt deliberate once I noticed how all the sleeping quarters were positioned. The windows pointed toward the perimeter fence or the motor pool, anywhere except toward the stone structure. Even the mess hall and recreation areas seemed designed to minimize sight lines to the center of the compound. I unpacked my gear and tried to shake off the weird first impression. Every base had its quirks, its unwritten rules and local politics. Maybe the keep was some kind of historical preservation thing, or it housed sensitive equipment that required security clearance I didn't have. There were always logical explanations for things that seemed strange at first glance. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse as the afternoon wore on. The soldiers here moved like they were constantly listening for something. Conversations happened in clusters, voices kept low, and people looked around more than necessary. During chow, I sat with a few guys who'd been here for a couple months, but when I mentioned the stone structure, they changed the subject so fast it felt rehearsed. "How's the action been out here?" I asked instead. "Quiet mostly," one of them said, picking at his food. "Some mortar attacks. Nothing too crazy." "Mortars?" "Yeah, usually at night. Random stuff, you know how it is." But he said it in a way that suggested it wasn't random at all. And when I asked follow-up questions, the guy suddenly remembered he had somewhere else to be. The sun started dropping toward the horizon around 7, and that's when the real strangeness began. Soldiers started going back to their quarters earlier than made sense for a base this size. The common areas emptied out, conversations got even quieter, and I noticed several guys checking their weapons with the kind of focus usually reserved for patrol prep. I walked back toward my barracks as twilight came over the compound and found myself looking at the keep again. The thing took over everything around it, not just because of its size, but because of how it seemed to soak up the last rays of sunlight. The stone was dark, almost black in the failing light, and the narrow windows looked like empty eye sockets. The modern military equipment scattered around the base, the satellite dishes, the armored vehicles, the prefab buildings, suddenly felt temporary and fragile compared to the very old structure. Like we were just the latest group to set up camp around something that had been here long before any of us were born and would still be here long after we left. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to figure out why a pile of old stones was making me so nervous. The keep was just a building, probably built by some medieval warlord who'd controlled trade routes through this area centuries ago. There was nothing inherently threatening about history, but something about the place felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just wrong in a way that made me want to look anywhere else. The other soldiers had been avoiding it all day, and now I understood why. The keep didn't just sit at the center of the base, it seemed to press down on everything around it, creating an atmosphere that made normal conversation feel too loud and silence feel too heavy. I headed inside and tried to settle into my bunk, but sleep didn't come easily. Through the thin walls, I could hear other soldiers moving around, the quiet sounds of people who weren't quite ready to let their guard down for the night. Whatever was different about this assignment, I was starting to understand that my second deployment wasn't going to be anything like my first. I'd been lying awake for hours when the first explosion hit. The blast threw me from my bunk onto the concrete floor, and before I could process what was happening, the compound broke out in chaos. Mortars screamed overhead, going off one after another across the base. The thin walls of the barracks shook with each impact, dust raining down from the ceiling as emergency lights kicked on. "Incoming! Take cover!" Soldiers poured from their bunks, grabbing weapons and gear as more explosions rocked the compound. I grabbed my rifle and body armor, muscle memory from basic training taking over as I stumbled toward the door. The attack felt different from anything I'd experienced during my first deployment. More focused, more deliberate in its targeting. Outside, the base had turned into a war zone. Smoke rose from several impact sites, and the sharp smell of burning fuel mixed with cordite filled the night air. I could hear shouting from multiple directions as soldiers took defensive positions, but the voices sounded strangely quiet, like everyone was trying to stay silent, even during an attack. I ran toward a concrete barrier near the communications bunker, diving behind it as another mortar round exploded maybe 50 yards away. The blast wave washed over me, leaving my ears ringing and my vision blurred. Through the haze of smoke and dust, I could make out other soldiers positioned around the compound, their movements more disciplined than panicked. That's when I saw Clark. He was crouched behind a generator shed about 30 yards from my position, his rifle raised toward the perimeter fence. Even in the chaos, I recognized his boyish profile and the careful way he held his weapon. Another explosion lit up the compound, and in that brief moment of light, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Something moved through the shadows beyond the perimeter lights. Small, maybe 4 feet tall, but moving with a speed and purpose that seemed impossible. At first I thought it might be a child, but the way it moved was wrong. Too smooth, too predatory. And its eyes had their own pale light, visible even through the smoke. The thing approached Clark's position with deliberate stealth, keeping to the darkest areas between buildings. Clark hadn't seen it yet, his attention focused on the direction the mortars were coming from. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but another explosion drowned out any sound I might have made. The creature reached Clark before I could react. It grabbed him from behind with impossible strength, lifting his entire body off the ground like he weighed nothing. Clark's rifle clattered to the concrete as he fought desperately, his legs kicking and arms flailing against his attacker. He managed to let out one terrified scream that cut through the noise of the attack. "Help! Something's got me! Help!" I watched in frozen horror as the creature dragged Clark backward into the darkness beyond the lights. He fought every step of the way, clawing at the ground and trying to break free, but the thing's grip never let up. Clark's cries grew more desperate as he disappeared into the shadows, his voice bouncing off the buildings. "Please, somebody help me, please." Then the screaming stopped. I stayed crouched behind the barrier, my rifle shaking in my hands as I looked at the spot where Clark had disappeared. My mind wouldn't process what I'd just seen. The creature had been too small to overpower a trained soldier, but it had picked up Clark like he was made of paper. And those eyes, they'd glowed with their own light, not reflecting anything from around us. The mortar attack went on for another 10 minutes, but I barely noticed the explosions. I kept watching the darkness where Clark had disappeared, hoping to see him come back, hoping I'd imagined the whole thing. But the area stayed empty, and no more screams came from the shadows. When the incoming fire finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than the explosions had. Soldiers began coming out from their cover positions, checking equipment and calling out status reports. The practiced efficiency of their movements suggested this wasn't their first experience with attacks like this. Sergeant Torres appeared near the command post, doing a head count with the same careful precision he'd shown during my arrival. His voice carried across the compound as he called out names and got responses. The routine felt weird after what I'd just seen. "Clark," Torres called. "Private Clark, report." No answer came from the darkness. "Clark," he called again, louder this time. I stood up from behind the barrier, my legs unsteady as I walked toward Torres. Other soldiers were gathering around him, their expressions serious, but not surprised. Nobody seemed to be looking for Clark or preparing to mount a search. "Brooks," Torres continued down his list. "Private Brooks, report." Another silence, another missing soldier from somewhere else in the compound. "Sergeant," I said, approaching the group. "I saw what happened to Clark. Something grabbed him and dragged him away from his position." Torres looked up from his clipboard, his face illuminated by the emergency lighting. "Combat stress, Mitchell. Explosions can mess with your head, make you see things that aren't there. It wasn't a hallucination. I saw a creature maybe 4 feet tall with glowing eyes. It took Clark into the shadows beyond the perimeter." The other soldiers exchanged glances, but nobody supported my account. Torres studied my face for a moment, then made a note on his clipboard. "You experienced your first mortar attack tonight," he said. "Disorientation is normal. The mind tries to make sense of chaos by creating explanations that feel more manageable than random violence. I know what I saw." "What you saw," Torres interrupted, "was the effects of combat stress and adrenaline. Clark and Brooks were caught in the open during incoming fire. They're casualties of enemy action, nothing more." I looked around at the faces of the other soldiers, searching for any sign that someone else had seen what I'd seen. But their expressions stayed carefully neutral, showing nothing. They accepted Torres's explanation without question, as if missing soldiers during attacks was just another part of deployment life. "Aren't we going to search for them?" I asked. "They might be wounded somewhere, need medical attention." "Negative," Torres said. "No personnel moves beyond the perimeter until daylight, base protocol during night attacks." "But if they're hurt?" "They're casualties, Mitchell. Written off. End of discussion. Torres turned away to continue his head count, leaving me standing there with a dozen questions and no one willing to answer them. The other soldiers began going back to their duties, checking equipment and looking at damage from the attack. Their movements carried the tired efficiency of people who'd been through this routine before. I walked back toward my barracks, passing the spot where Clark had been positioned. His rifle lay where it had fallen, left on the concrete beside the generator shed. Nobody had picked it up. Nobody had marked the location for investigation. The weapon just sat there like a piece of junk. The compound was already returning to normal operations, as if two soldiers hadn't just disappeared into the darkness. Emergency teams looked at damage to buildings and equipment. Communications personnel got back in contact with higher command, and the duty roster continued without changes. The missing men were simply erased from the night's activities. Back in the barracks, I found other soldiers getting into their bunks with the same casual attitude they'd shown before the attack. Nobody talked about what had happened to Clark and Brooks. Nobody wondered about their fate or showed concern for their welfare. The conversation focused on equipment damage and tomorrow's duty assignments. I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of what I'd seen. The creature had been real. Not a hallucination or a trick of shadows. It had moved with intelligence and purpose, picking Clark specifically from among the available targets. And the way it had overpowered him suggested strength far beyond what its size should have allowed. The casual acceptance of the disappearances bothered me more than the attack itself. These soldiers had been through this before, possibly multiple times. They expected to lose people during mortar attacks, but not to enemy fire. They expected them to be taken by something else entirely. I thought about the keep sitting at the center of the compound, the way everyone avoided looking at it or talking about its purpose. The strange behavior of the soldiers, their whispered conversations and constant watching. The way Torres had responded to my questions about the structure with immediate suspicion. Whatever was happening at this base had been going on for longer than my deployment. Clark and Brooks weren't the first soldiers to disappear during night attacks, and unless something changed, they wouldn't be the last. The military hierarchy knew about it, accepted it, and continued operating the base anyway. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but Clark's screams repeated in my memory. The desperate way he'd fought against his attacker, the terror in his voice as he'd called for help that never came. Tomorrow would bring new duties, new routines, and the pretense that two men hadn't disappeared into the darkness. But I would remember what I'd seen, and I would start looking for answers, whether Torres wanted me to or not. I spent the next day asking questions that nobody wanted to answer. Every conversation about Clark and Brooks ended the same way. Quick subject changes, sudden leaving, or flat denials that anything unusual had happened. The official story stayed the same. Enemy mortars had killed 2 soldiers during a coordinated attack. Case closed. Move on. But I couldn't move on. Clark's screams kept playing in my head, along with the image of that small figure dragging him into the darkness. The thing had moved too fast, been too strong, and those glowing eyes hadn't belonged to any human combatant I'd ever seen. The other soldiers went about their duties like nothing had changed. Equipment got repaired, patrols continued, and the duty roster rolled on without Clark and Brooks. Their gear disappeared from the barracks, their bunks got reassigned, and within 24 hours, it was like they'd never existed. Evening chow came and went with the usual quiet conversations and downcast eyes. I picked at my food while watching the other soldiers, trying to read the tension that seemed to get thicker as darkness got closer. Nobody talked about the night coming or made plans for defensive positions. They just ate in silence and checked their weapons with the automatic precision of routine. Around 7 o'clock, Sergeant Torres entered the mess hall carrying a small bundle wrapped in canvas cloth. He set it on a table near the center of the room and called for attention. "Listen up. Everyone not on duty. Gather around." The soldiers moved toward the table with reluctant steps, their faces carrying expressions I couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Torres unwrapped the canvas to show a collection of straws cut to different lengths. "Time for the draw," Torres announced. One of the older soldiers, a lean guy named Christopher Reed who'd been avoiding me since my arrival, stepped forward first. He reached into the bundle and pulled out a straw, holding it up to check its length. Medium. His shoulders moved back a little. Other soldiers followed, each taking their turn at what was clearly an established ritual. Some got long straws and let out their breath in relief. Others drew shorter ones and accepted their fate with grim resignation. I watched the process with growing confusion until Torres gestured for me to approach. "Mitchell, your turn. What exactly am I drawing for?" Torres studied my face for a moment, then looked around at the soldiers. "Guess it's time you learned how this place really works." He pointed to the straws in my hand and those held by the other soldiers. "Short straws mean you're outside tonight. Watch duty during the attack. Long straws mean you stay inside the buildings." "What attack? Intelligence hasn't reported any—" "They come every night," Torres interrupted. "Have for decades. British forces figured out the system during World War II, and we've kept it going ever since." The casual way he delivered this information made my stomach drop. "You're saying attacks happen every single night?" "Mortars, usually. Sometimes rockets. Always after dark, always coordinated." Torres gestured toward the keep, visible through the mess hall windows. "That structure's been here longer than any of us. Longer than this base, longer than the war. And the things that live underneath it have been hunting soldiers for over 70 years. Red stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The creatures only take people who are outside during the attacks. Inside the buildings, you're generally safe. But someone has to maintain watch positions." I looked down at the straw in my hand, medium length, not the shortest, but nowhere near the longest either. "This is insane," I said. "You're talking about deliberately sacrificing soldiers to—" "To what?" Torres asked. "To things that shouldn't exist? To creatures that military science can't explain or classify?" He shook his head. "Nobody reports what really happens here, Mitchell. Official records show enemy action, killed in action by mortar rounds. Clean, simple, explainable. But you know the truth. We know enough to stay alive. The draw keeps it random, keeps it fair. Nobody has to volunteer to die, but somebody has to be outside when they come hunting." Reed moved closer, his weathered face carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been through this routine too many times. "This is my third tour here. I've seen maybe 40 soldiers disappear over the years, each one officially listed as combat casualties, each one actually dragged away by things that shouldn't exist. The military knows about this?" "Course they know," Torres said. "Base has strategic value, controls important terrain, acceptable loss rate for maintaining position in the region. Command figures a few soldiers per month is worth keeping this outpost operational." I felt the walls of the mess hall closing in as the full horror of the situation became clear. The strange behavior of the soldiers, their whispered conversations and constant vigilance, the way they'd accepted Clark and Brooks's disappearances without question, it all made sense now. "How many soldiers draw short straws tonight?" "Usually 3 or 4. Depends on how many we have available." Torres began collecting the straws from soldiers who'd completed their draws. "Tonight looks like 4 positions need coverage." I checked my straw again. Still medium length, but watching the remaining soldiers draw made me realize how many short straws were still in the bundle. The odds weren't in anyone's favor. Reed finished his explanation in the same quiet tone he'd kept throughout the conversation. "The things underground don't care about rank or experience. They take whoever they can reach. The system keeps the losses manageable while keeping us operational." "Manageable losses?" I repeated. You're talking about sending people to die. We're talking about survival, Torres corrected. This base exists because someone figured out how to coexist with whatever lives in that keep. The alternative is losing everyone instead of just a few. The last soldier completed his draw, and Torres counted the short straws. 4 soldiers had drawn watch duty, their faces showing the resignation of people who'd accepted a terrible lottery. None of them protested or asked for reassignment. They just checked their gear and prepared for a night that might be their last. Torres wrapped up the remaining straws and put them away in the canvas cloth. Positions are assigned based on seniority and experience. Reed, you take the communications bunker. Patterson gets the motor pool. Williams covers the eastern perimeter. Mitchell, you're on the western approach. I realized I'd drawn one of the short straws without even noticing. The medium-length straw I'd been holding was actually among the shortest in the bundle. In a few hours, I'd be outside during an attack, exposed to whatever had taken Clark and Brooks. Questions? Torres asked. I had 100 questions, but none that would change my assignment or improve my chances of survival. The system had been operating for decades, refined through trial and error into a grimly efficient method of feeding the creatures while keeping the base functional. No questions, Sergeant. Torres nodded and sent the group away. Soldiers went back to their rooms to get their equipment ready and write letters they hoped wouldn't be their last. How easily everyone accepted the situation bothered me more than the danger we were facing. Reed walked over as I was checking my rifle for the 3rd time. First time getting picked? Yeah. Stick to your position, keep quiet, and don't try to help anyone else. The things are attracted to movement and noise. Sometimes they ignore isolated targets if bigger disturbances are available. How encouraging. It's not encouragement. It's survival advice from someone who's drawn short straws 9 times and lived through all of them. Reed shouldered his own weapon and headed toward the door. See you in the morning, Mitchell, assuming we both make it that long. 3 weeks of dreading the straw draw had prepared me for this moment, but my hands still shook as I checked my rifle for the 4th time. The short piece of dried grass sat on my foot locker like an accusation, barely 2 inches long compared to the 6-inch straw Reed had pulled earlier that evening. I'd watched 17 draws since that first night when Torres explained the system. Watched other soldiers receive their death sentences with the same grim acceptance I was trying to get together now. The math was simple and brutal. With roughly 30 soldiers rotating through the lottery, everyone's number came up eventually. My assigned position sat in a corner where the communications bunker met the outer perimeter wall, offering decent cover but limited escape routes. The spot had strategic value for watching the compound's eastern approach, which made it a logical choice for watch duty. It also put me roughly 50 yards from the keep, close enough to see the dark stones even in low light. The other soldiers drawing short straws tonight had spread out to their positions an hour ago. Brooks headed toward the motor pool, his usual quiet confidence replaced by the mechanical movements of someone going through practiced motions. Hayes took his post near the ammunition depot, checking his weapon one final time before disappearing into the shadows between storage buildings. I got comfortable in my corner as full darkness came, wedging myself between concrete barriers in a way that offered protection from multiple angles. My rifle lay across my knees, safety off, magazine full. The weapon provided minimal comfort against threats I didn't understand and couldn't predict. The compound grew quiet in the way that came before attacks, with even routine sounds fading to whispers. Emergency lighting spread across the open areas, creating pools of visibility separated by stretches of darkness you couldn't see through. Every shadow could hide movement. Every structure could hide approaching threats. 23 minutes past 9, the first mortar round whistled overhead. The explosion lit up the compound's western edge, sending debris and smoke spiraling into the night air. Before the sound faded, more rounds followed in rapid succession, each impact closer to the base's center. The attacks always followed the same pattern. scattered at first, then concentrating on key facilities. I pressed deeper into my corner as shrapnel rattled off nearby structures, the chaos of incoming fire mixing with something far worse. Through the smoke and scattered emergency lighting, shapes began moving in the shadows. Small figures, maybe 4 feet tall, came out from areas I hadn't seen them approach. The creatures moved with purpose rather than panic, threading between explosions like they knew exactly where each round would land. Their pale skin reflected available light, making them visible against darker backgrounds, and their eyes glowed with their own cold light. They spread across the compound in coordinated groups, each one heading toward assigned hunting grounds. One of them approached Brooks's position near the motor pool. Even at 50 yards distance, I could see the thing's unnatural walk, too fluid for something with human proportions. It kept to the deepest shadows, moving only when explosions covered the sound of its footsteps. Brooks stayed focused on the perimeter, looking for threats from outside the base rather than from within the compound. The creature reached his position and grabbed him from behind before he could react. Brooks spun around, trying to bring his rifle to bear, but the thing's grip was already locked around his torso. It lifted him off the ground with impossible strength, his boots kicking uselessly as he fought against his attacker. His rifle clattered to the concrete, abandoned. "Help!" Brooks's voice cut through the noise of continuing explosions. "Something's got me! Help!" He thrashed desperately, trying to break free or at least slow their movement toward the shadows beyond the motor pool. The creature dragged him backward with steady persistence, ignoring his struggles like they were minor inconveniences. Brooks's boots scraped against the ground, leaving marks in the dirt that would be gone by morning. "Please, somebody help me." His screams got more frantic as they moved away from the lights, but no one came to help him. The other soldiers on watch had their own survival to worry about, and the ones safely inside the buildings wouldn't risk coming out to help someone already taken. Brooks's cries bounced off the nearby buildings for maybe 30 seconds before cutting off suddenly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the explosions, and I found myself trying to hear any sound from the darkness where he'd disappeared. Nothing came back except the continuing whistle and crash of incoming mortars. I wiped sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, trying to process what I'd just seen. The creature had moved with intelligent purpose, picking Brooks specifically from multiple available targets. It had approached from his blind side, used the cover of explosions to hide its movement, and overpowered a trained soldier without any real effort. Movement to the side snapped my attention back to immediate threats. Another creature was approaching my position, moving along the perimeter wall with the same smooth motion I'd seen earlier. This one was smaller than the thing that had taken Brooks, but its glowing eyes held the same predatory focus. It moved with careful steps, pausing occasionally to check its surroundings before continuing forward. I pressed myself deeper into the corner between concrete barriers, trying to become invisible against the rough surfaces. My rifle remained across my knees, but bringing it up to firing position would require movement that might attract attention. The creature was maybe 20 yards away, close enough that I could see details of its pale features. Its face looked almost human except for the oversized eyes and complete lack of expression. The skin appeared smooth and hairless, stretched tight over angular bone structure. Its limbs were proportioned wrong, too long for its torso, giving it reach that went beyond what its size suggested. 15 yards away, 10 yards. The thing moved with complete silence, its feet making no sound against the concrete. Those glowing eyes swept back and forth, searching for targets or signs of movement. Each step brought it closer to my hiding spot, and I realized my position offered hiding but not protection if the creature decided to investigate thoroughly. I held my breath as it reached the edge of my hiding area, its pale face turning toward the corner where I sat, motionless. For several seconds, we remained frozen in place. The creature evaluating potential prey, me trying to disappear into the shadows. Its eyes were the size of tennis balls, completely white except for black pupils that reflected what little light was available. A mortar round exploded maybe 30 yards away, the blast wave washing over our position with enough force to rattle nearby equipment. The creature's head snapped toward the explosion, its attention drawn by the sudden noise and movement. For a moment, it stood undecided, weighing whether to investigate me or pursue whatever the explosion might have revealed. The choice was made for it when another blast, closer this time, sent debris flying across the compound. The creature abandoned its investigation of my corner and moved quickly toward the source of the disturbance, disappearing into the smoke and shadows with the same smooth motion it had used to approach. I remained motionless for several more minutes, listening to the continuing attack while my heart rate gradually returned to something approaching normal. The creature had been close enough to touch, close enough that I could have reached out and grabbed it if I'd been insane enough to try. Its retreat felt like a temporary break rather than genuine safety. The mortar attack continued for another 20 minutes, following the usual pattern of concentrated fire followed by gradual reduction in frequency. As the explosions tapered off, I began hearing voices from other positions around the compound, soldiers calling out status reports and checking equipment damage. When the incoming fire finally stopped, I waited an additional 10 minutes before emerging from my hiding spot. The compound was already returning to post-attack routines, with damage assessment teams moving between buildings and communications personnel re-establishing contact with higher command. I walked toward the motor pool, hoping against logic that Brooks might have somehow escaped or hidden during the attack. His rifle still lay where it had fallen, but no other sign of his presence remained. The dirt showed scuff marks where he'd been dragged, but those tracks faded into darkness beyond the range of emergency lighting. Sergeant Torres appeared near the command post, conducting his standard head count with mechanical efficiency. I approached him as he called out names, watching his expression for any sign that tonight's losses carried more weight than usual. "Brooks," Torres called. "Private Brooks, report." Silence. "Brooks," he called again, then made a note on his clipboard. "Hayes, Private Hayes, report." Another silence, another notation. I looked toward the ammunition depot where Hayes had been positioned, but saw no signs of activity in that direction. The area stayed dark and quiet, just another part of the compound that had been swept clean during the night's hunting. "Mitchell," Torres said, looking up from his list, "you made it through your first short draw." Brooks didn't. "Combat casualty. Enemy mortar fire." Torres continued down his roster without missing a beat. These things happen during attacks. I wanted to argue, to describe what I'd actually seen, but 3 weeks at this base had taught me it was pointless to challenge official explanations. Torres and the other long-term personnel had perfected the art of willful blindness, accepting necessary lies to maintain operational capability. Instead, I nodded and returned to my barracks, where other soldiers were already settling into their bunks. Nobody discussed the missing men or wondered about their fate. The conversation focused on equipment status and tomorrow's duty assignments, just like every other night. I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of my encounter with the creature. The intelligence I'd seen in its eyes, the way it had looked me over as potential prey, the careful manner of its approach and retreat. These things weren't mindless predators. They were hunters with enough reasoning ability to check threats and opportunities. The casual acceptance of Brooks and Hayes' disappearances bothered me as much as the disappearances themselves. Another 2 soldiers erased from the roster, another notation in Torres's logbook, another night of feeding the things that lived beneath the keep. The system continued functioning with the same efficiency it had maintained for decades. But I couldn't continue functioning within that system, not after seeing one of those creatures up close not after seeing the intelligence behind its predatory behavior. The straw drawing would continue, more soldiers would be selected for exterior duty, and the disappearances would go on indefinitely unless someone found a way to break the cycle. The keep sat at the center of everything, the focal point that drew both the creatures and the attacks that provided them with hunting opportunities. Torres had made it clear that the structure was off limits, but Torres hadn't been the one crouched in a corner while one of those things looked him over for dinner. I needed answers about what lived underneath that very old stone pile. I needed to understand how the creatures operated, where they came from, and whether there was any way to stop them permanently. The official prohibition against approaching the keep no longer carried weight against the certainty that drawing short straws would eventually get me killed. The investigation would have to be carefully planned and executed without alerting Torres or the other soldiers who'd accepted this nightmare as normal operating procedure. But it was going to happen, regardless of the risks involved. I'd survived my first encounter with the creatures through luck rather than skill. Next time, I wanted to be prepared with knowledge instead of just hoping for another fortunate explosion. I woke the next morning with a plan that felt both necessary and dangerous. The memory of pale eyes watching me in the darkness had turned into something harder than fear: determination. If I was going to survive more nights like that, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. The base's administrative office was in a prefab building near the communications center, its interior crammed with filing cabinets and dust-covered boxes that hadn't been touched in months. I volunteered for inventory duty, which gave me legitimate access to records dating back to the base's establishment. Most personnel avoided paperwork detail, making it the perfect cover for research. The earliest files contained British military documents from 1943, written in formal language that barely hid the author's confusion and alarm. Lieutenant Colonel William Hartwell had established the outpost to control strategic mountain passes, selecting this location for its high position and existing stone fortifications. His initial reports described the keep as a very old structure of unknown origin, possibly dating to the medieval period when Silk Road traders required defensive positions. Hartwell's tone changed dramatically in later reports. By October 1943, he was documenting unexplained personnel losses during enemy engagements and requesting immediate reassignment of his unit. His final report, dated November 15, 1943, contained a single line: "Situation untenable. Recommend abandonment of position." The British had withdrawn 2 weeks later, but American forces took over the site in 1944. Their records followed the same pattern: initial optimism about the strategic value, followed by increasingly frantic requests for explanation of mounting casualties. Each commanding officer lasted roughly 6 months before requesting transfer or suffering what the files called combat stress casualties. I spread the documents across a makeshift workspace, creating a timeline that covered 8 decades. Every military unit stationed here had experienced the same nightmare: Soviet forces during their occupation, various Mujahideen groups during the Civil War years, and finally American troops during the current conflict. The location changed hands regularly, but the disappearances remained constant. A personnel roster from 1987 listed 43 Soviet soldiers assigned to the outpost. By the time they withdrew 6 months later, only 19 remained classified as operational. The missing weren't listed as killed in action or wounded. They simply vanished from the records, their names crossed out in red ink without explanation. Christopher Red appeared in the doorway as I was photographing a particularly detailed British report with my phone's camera. He looked around the empty office, then stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Finding anything interesting in the old files?" I looked up from the documents, trying to read his expression. Reed had been at this base longer than anyone except Torres, and his weathered features carried the accumulated weight of too many nights drawing straws. Depends what you consider interesting. 70 years of soldiers disappearing in exactly the same way might qualify. Reed moved closer to examine the papers I'd spread across the desk. His eyes lingered on a Soviet document that included hand-drawn sketches of what looked like pale humanoid figures with oversized eyes. You're not the first to go digging through those files. Most soldiers who've been here long enough get curious eventually. He pulled a chair close to the desk and sat down heavily. Question is what you plan to do with what you find. Learn enough to stop it from happening. That's what they all say. Reed was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the calculating look of someone deciding whether to share a dangerous secret. Come with me. There's something you need to see. He took me through the compound to his room, a small space that was different from other barracks only because it had no personal stuff at all. No photos, no letters from home, no books or magazines, just military gear arranged perfectly. Reed opened his footlocker and took out a bundle wrapped in oiled canvas. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age and stained with what looked like blood. The cover had no identifying marks, but the first page had dozens of names written in different handwriting styles, dating from 1943 to present day. Each name had been signed with a date and unit designation. Every soldier who's spent more than 3 months at this base and lived to rotate out has added their name to this book, Reed explained. It's passed down from one group to the next, hidden from command personnel who prefer official ignorance. I opened to a random page dated 1956 and found detailed sketches with cramped handwriting. The drawings showed the creatures with scientific precision. Their bone structure, estimated proportions, and notable features like the glowing eyes and long limbs. The text described hunting patterns, preferred prey selection, and behavioral observations. They're approximately 4 feet in height, I read aloud from one entry. Pale skin appears almost luminescent in darkness. Eyes glow with cold white light that serves as their primary sensory mechanism. Physical strength far exceeds what their size would suggest. They move with coordinated intelligence, suggesting complex social organization. Reed turned several pages to show me entries from different decades, each containing similar observations written by different hands. The consistency of details across generations of witnesses was unsettling. These weren't hallucinations or combat stress fantasies, but documented encounters with something that had remained unchanged for 70 years. Keep reading, Reed said quietly. I found entries from American soldiers during the Soviet-Afghan War, describing creatures coming out of underground passages during nighttime attacks. A British corporal from 1962 had drawn detailed maps showing tunnel entrances around the keep's edge. A Soviet lieutenant from 1984 had documented feeding behavior, describing the creatures carrying captured soldiers into underground chambers. The journal entries got more desperate as I moved toward more recent dates. Soldiers pleaded for reassignment, described nightmares that prevented sleep, and begged commanding officers to acknowledge what was happening. Many entries ended with variations of the same phrase. Nobody believes us. Nobody cares. The mission continues. How long have you been adding to this? I asked. 3rd tour. Started my entries in 2019. Reed turned to a section near the back of the journal showing pages of text in his neat handwriting. Took me 18 months to figure out the pattern. The attacks aren't random enemy action. They're coordinated hunting expeditions. His entries included timing charts showing the correlation between creature sightings and mortar attacks. The data was compelling. Attacks always occurred when creatures were observed moving near the perimeter, and the intensity of incoming fire seemed designed to drive soldiers into exposed positions rather than cause maximum casualties. You think the attackers are working with these things? I think the attackers are these things. Different groups, same species. The ones underground do the hunting. The ones in the mountains provide covering fire to mask the noise and create chaos. Reed pointed to a detailed analysis he'd written comparing weapon signatures from recorded attacks. Mortars always land in the same general pattern, designed to scatter personnel rather than destroy facilities. It's a herding operation. The truth hit me hard. If Reed was right, the creatures weren't just random predators. They were organized hunters using smart tactics to farm human prey. The base wasn't under attack by human rebels at all, but serving as a feeding station for something that had been getting better at this for decades. I turned to more recent entries, finding names I knew among the writers. Clark had written several pages describing his growing fear of night duty. Brooks had written down his observations of creature movement patterns. Hayes had added sketches of tunnel entrances he'd spotted during day patrols. All three had signed their names and added final entries on the same date, the night they'd drawn short straws and disappeared. They knew what was going to happen to them. Everyone who stays here long enough figures it out eventually. The straw system isn't random bad luck. It's systematic feeding of a predator population that's been using this location as hunting grounds since before any of us were born. Reed closed the journal and rewrapped it in the canvas covering. The weight of accumulated testimony and evidence felt overwhelming, but it also provided something the official records lacked: actual information about the creature's behavior and weaknesses. What about the keep itself? Has anyone ever tried to investigate the source? Couple soldiers over the years have tried. British captain in 1961 went down into the tunnels during daylight hours. Never came back. American sergeant in 1978 attempted the same thing. Same result. Reed locked the journal back in his footlocker and turned to face me directly. The structure is off limits for good reason. It's not just their hunting ground, it's their home. But if someone could map the tunnel system, find their nesting areas, you'd end up as another name in that journal. Another soldier who disappeared trying to be a hero. Reed's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd seen too many people make the same mistake. The creatures have been down there for generations, maybe centuries. They know every tunnel, every chamber, every hiding spot. You go down there, you're entering their territory on their terms. I understood his warning, but I couldn't accept his conclusion. The journal proved that soldiers had been documenting these encounters for decades without finding a solution. They'd mapped behavior patterns, identified hunting methods, and read detailed observations, but none of that information had stopped the disappearances or broken the cycle of sacrifice. The keep sat at the center of everything, the focal point that drew the creatures to the surface and provided access to their underground domain. If there was a way to end this nightmare permanently, the answer had to be somewhere in those old stones and the tunnels beneath them. Reed seemed to read my thoughts from my expression. Don't even think about it, Mitchell. I've seen that look before, on faces of soldiers who thought they could solve this problem through direct action. They all ended up feeding those things. How many more soldiers have to disappear before someone tries a different approach? However many it takes to maintain operational security and complete the mission. Command has decided the strategic value of this position outweighs personnel losses. Our job is to follow orders and survive our rotations, not to play hero. Reed's acceptance of the situation frustrated me more than Torres's official denials. At least Torres maintained the pretense that enemy action was responsible for the casualties. Reed knew the truth and had chosen to go along with it rather than fight it. But going along with it meant accepting that soldiers would continue dying to feed creatures that treated the base as their personal hunting preserve. It meant drawing straws every night, knowing that short pieces of grass represented death sentences for whoever pulled them. It meant watching friends and colleagues disappear into underground chambers where they'd be consumed by things that shouldn't exist. I couldn't accept that, no matter how many previous attempts had failed. The journal had provided valuable intelligence about creature behavior and tunnel locations. Combined with the historical documents, I now had a clearer picture of what lived beneath the keep and how it had operated for decades. The information wasn't complete, but it was enough to begin planning an approach that might succeed where previous attempts had failed. Reed returned the journal to his footlocker and secured the lock with practiced movements. "Promise me you won't try anything stupid. The system works because it's predictable. Start disrupting the pattern, and you might make things worse for everyone." I nodded without making any actual promises. Reed had survived multiple tours by accepting the horror and working within its constraints. That approach had kept him alive, but it had also enabled the creatures to continue hunting with impunity. The keep remained off limits according to official orders, but those orders had been issued to protect a system that deliberately fed soldiers to predators. Following those orders meant participating in my own eventual murder and the murder of every other soldier assigned to this base. I walked back to my quarters with my head full of names from the journal and images from the historical documents. 70 years of soldiers had faced the same choice I was facing now: accept the nightmare or try to end it. Most had chosen acceptance and survival. A few had chosen resistance and disappeared. But none of them had possessed the full picture I was now assembling from decades of accumulated evidence. None of them had understood the scope of the operation or the intelligence behind the creature's hunting methods, and none of them had been desperate enough to risk everything on a plan that violated every regulation and went against every piece of advice from experienced personnel. The keep was waiting in the darkness outside my window, its very old stones holding secrets that might finally explain how to break this cycle permanently. Tomorrow I would begin planning an approach to those tunnels, regardless of the consequences. The journal had taught me that knowledge without action was worthless. Previous soldiers had documented everything except a solution, and their careful observations had done nothing to save the men who came after them. I wasn't going to add my name to that list of careful observers. I was going to find a way to end this, or I was going to die trying. The next straw draw came 3 nights later. I pulled a long piece this time: safety inside the buildings while others faced the creatures outside. The relief should have been overwhelming, but instead I found myself checking my rifle and ammunition with the same careful attention I'd watched doomed soldiers use before their final watches. Reed noticed my preparations as I loaded extra magazines and secured my tactical vest. "You drew long tonight, Mitchell. Stay inside, stay alive." "Right." I tucked my sidearm into its holster and made sure the retention strap was loose for quick access. Just want to be ready if something goes wrong. He studied my face with those cold eyes that had kept him alive through multiple tours. "Don't do anything stupid. The system works because people follow the rules." I nodded and walked toward the barracks with the other lucky soldiers. But my mind was already running through the plan I'd been working on since reading that journal. The mortar attacks followed predictable patterns: scattered strikes for the first 10 minutes, then concentrated fire on the eastern perimeter to drive the creature's prey toward their hunting grounds near the motor pool and communications center. That concentration period would give me roughly 15 minutes when the western approach to the keep would be relatively clear of both explosions and creature activity. 15 minutes to reach the old structure, find an entrance, and begin the investigation that might finally end this nightmare. I waited in the barracks until the first explosions began, then slipped out through the rear door while other soldiers moved to interior positions away from windows and outer walls. The compound was already filling with smoke and the acrid smell of burning fuel, providing perfect cover for unauthorized movement. The keep rose 40 feet above the surrounding buildings, its dark stones seeming to absorb the emergency lighting rather than reflect it. Up close, the structure looked even older than I'd realized. hand-carved blocks fitted together with precision that belonged to master craftsmen from centuries past. The narrow window slits were positioned to provide defensive coverage of the surrounding area, but they also looked like empty eye sockets watching everything that happened below. I walked around the base of the keep, searching for any opening large enough to fit a human. The mortar attacks were getting stronger, with explosions walking across the compound in the familiar pattern that would soon concentrate on the eastern perimeter. My window of opportunity was shrinking with each passing minute. On the north side, behind a pile of rubble that looked like it had been deliberately placed, I found what I was looking for. A narrow opening, maybe 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, had been cut into the stone at ground level. The edges were smooth and worn, suggesting decades of regular use. Someone had scattered debris around the entrance to hide it from casual observation, but the concealment wasn't intended to stop determined investigation. I squeezed through the opening, rifle held ready, and found myself in a space that defied the keep's external dimensions. The interior was vast, with tunnels extending in multiple directions beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. The air carried a stench that made my eyes water, decay and something else, something organic and wrong that I couldn't identify. The tunnel I chose sloped downward at a steady angle carved from living rock with the same precision I'd seen in the exterior stonework. My boots sounded loud no matter how quiet I tried to be, and I realized the sound would carry far ahead of my position. If anything was waiting down here, it would know I was coming long before I reached it. 20 yards into the tunnel, the darkness ahead began to glow with pale, cold light. Not artificial lighting, but the same glow I'd seen in the creature's eyes during my watch duty. The glow grew stronger as I moved deeper, and I realized I was approaching the source of that unnatural light. The tunnel opened into a chamber that made me stop breathing. Bodies were stacked against the walls like cordwood, dozens of them in various stages of decomposition. Some wore modern American uniforms, others had British insignia, and several displayed Soviet-era equipment. The newest corpses were positioned at the front of the stacks, while the oldest had been reduced to bone and rotted fabric at the back. I recognized Tyler Brooks immediately, his face now waxy and pale but still identifiable. Brandon Hayes lay beside him, his precisely maintained uniform torn and stained with blood that had dried to black crust. Their bodies showed evidence of systematic mutilation, limbs removed with surgical precision, torsos opened and organs extracted. They hadn't just been killed, they'd been harvested. The pale glow came from creatures moving between the bodies, 3 of them that I could see clearly. They worked with methodical efficiency, using tools I couldn't identify to continue their butchery of soldiers who had been alive just days ago. The things were exactly as described in the journal: 4 feet tall, elongated limbs, eyes that glowed with cold white light. One of them looked up from its work and noticed me standing in the tunnel entrance. For a moment, we stared at each other across the charnel house. The creature's face was almost human, except for those oversized eyes and the complete absence of any expression I could recognize. Its pale skin reflected the glow from its companions, making it appear luminescent in the darkness. The thing abandoned its feeding and began moving toward me with that fluid, unnatural walk I'd seen during my watch duty. The other creatures followed suit, dropping their tools and coming toward my position with obvious hostile intent. They moved without sound, flowing across the chamber floor like predators that had perfected the art of silent hunting. I brought my rifle to my shoulder and fired a 3-round burst at the nearest creature. The bullets struck center mass, spinning the thing around and dropping it to the stone floor. The body twitched once and went still, pale blood spreading beneath it in a growing pool. The other creatures stopped their advance and looked at their dead companion with what seemed like curiosity rather than alarm. They tilted their heads in unison, studying the corpse with the same detached interest they'd shown while butchering human remains. Then, instead of attacking, they turned and retreated deeper into the tunnels with the same fluid motion they'd used to approach. I moved cautiously into the chamber, rifle trained on the passages where the creatures had disappeared. The air was thick with the smell of death and something else, a musky animal scent that reminded me of caves and underground spaces. My boots crunched on bone fragments scattered across the floor, remnants of decades of feeding. The dead creature lay where it had fallen, allowing me my first close examination of one of these things. Its proportions were wrong in ways that became more apparent up close. Limbs too long for its torso, fingers extended with additional joints that gave them spider-like flexibility. The skin was translucent enough to show dark veins beneath, and the oversized eyes were clouded with death, but still retained traces of that unnatural glow. It looked almost human, but only in the way that a photograph might resemble its subject, recognizable but fundamentally different. Whatever these things were, they'd evolved or been created to mimic human appearance while possessing capabilities that far exceeded normal human limits. I moved between the stacks of bodies, counting faces I knew and faces I didn't in equal measure. Clark was there, his boyish features now slack and colorless. Reed had been wrong about the creatures only taking soldiers on watch duty. Some of these corpses wore the uniforms of personnel who should have been safely inside buildings during attacks. The systematic nature of the butchery was what disturbed me most. These weren't random kills or feeding frenzies. The creatures had been methodically harvesting human remains for specific purposes, removing organs and limbs with surgical precision. The older corpses showed the same pattern of mutilation, suggesting this had been going on exactly as described in the journal for decades. Evidence of the military's knowledge was everywhere. Dog tags from different eras lay scattered among the remains, along with equipment that should have been recovered and accounted for. Personal effects that families would never receive, weapons that should have been returned to inventory. All of it abandoned down here while official reports listed the owners as combat casualties. Mortar explosions bounced down the tunnels, reminding me that my window of opportunity was closing. The creatures had retreated rather than fighting, but that didn't mean they wouldn't return with reinforcements. I needed to document what I'd found and get out before the attack ended, and my absence was noticed. I used my phone to photograph the chamber from multiple angles, capturing the stacks of bodies and the evidence of systematic butchery. The images would provide proof of what was happening here, documentation that couldn't be dismissed as combat stress or hallucinations. The dead creature would serve as physical evidence that these things were real and had been feeding on soldiers for generations. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scattered among the older remains were pieces of equipment that predated the current conflict by decades. British webbing from the 1940s, Soviet ammunition pouches from the 1980s, American gear from various deployments stretching back to the early 2000s. The creatures had been using this chamber as their feeding ground for exactly as long as the historical documents suggested. The military hadn't just known about the creatures. They'd been deliberately feeding them soldiers for 70 years. The base wasn't a strategic outpost that happened to be plagued by unexplained disappearances. It was a feeding station, maintained specifically to provide the creatures with regular meals while allowing various government agencies to study them from a safe distance. Torres, Reed, and every other long-term soldier at the base had been complicit in this system. The straw drawing wasn't a survival mechanism. It was a selection process for deciding which soldiers would be delivered to the creatures. The mortar attacks weren't enemy action. They were herding operations designed to drive prey toward the hunting grounds. I had stumbled into the middle of a program that treated human soldiers as acceptable losses in service of some larger agenda. The creatures were being fed and studied while official reports maintained the fiction that combat operations were proceeding normally. Families received folded flags and official condolences, while their sons and daughters were being systematically murdered to feed things that shouldn't exist. The explosions were tapering off, signaling the end of the attack and the beginning of the post-action phase when Torres would conduct his head count. I needed to get back to the barracks before my absence was noticed, but I also needed to ensure that evidence of what I'd discovered would survive if something happened to me. I sent the photographs to my personal email account, along with GPS coordinates for the keep's entrance and a detailed description of what I'd found in the chamber. If I disappeared like so many others, at least someone would eventually know the truth about what had happened here. The return journey through the tunnels felt longer than the approach, every shadow potentially hiding creatures that might have circled around to cut off my escape route. But I reached the concealed entrance without encountering anything, emerging into the compound as the last mortar rounds exploded in the distance. Smoke hung heavy in the air, providing cover for my movement back to the barracks. Other soldiers were already emerging from their protected positions, checking equipment and preparing for Torres's inevitable roll call. I slipped through the rear door and took my assigned position with the other long-straw soldiers, hoping my absence hadn't been noticed during the chaos. Torres appeared on schedule, clipboard in hand, calling out names with his usual mechanical efficiency. When he reached the short-straw soldiers, the responses came back with grim predictability. 2 soldiers answered immediately, confirming their survival. The third call went unanswered, then was repeated with the same result. "Patterson," Torres called a third time. "Private Patterson, report." Quiet. Another note on the clipboard. I watched Torres's face as he marked Patterson as a casualty, looking for any sign that he understood what had actually happened to the missing soldier. His expression stayed professionally neutral, but something in his eyes suggested he knew exactly where Patterson had gone and why he wouldn't be coming back. The system continued working with its usual efficiency. Damage assessment teams moved between buildings, communications personnel got back in touch with higher command, and everyone got into post-attack routines that ignored another soldier going missing. By morning, Patterson's personal effects would be gone, his bunk would be reassigned, and his name would be entered into official records as another combat casualty. But this time, I knew the truth. I'd seen the feeding chamber, documented the evidence, and confirmed that the military had been deliberately sacrificing soldiers to creatures that treated the base as their personal hunting ground. The question now was what to do with that knowledge, and whether I could find a way to end this nightmare permanently. The keep stood in the darkness outside my window, its very old stones holding secrets that went far deeper than I'd thought. Tomorrow I would need to decide whether to report what I discovered through official channels or find another way to expose the truth. Either choice carried enormous risks, but doing nothing meant accepting that more soldiers would disappear into those tunnels to feed the things that lived beneath the keep. I'd entered the tunnels looking for answers and found a horror that exceeded my worst fears. The creatures weren't just predators, they were being deliberately fed by people who should have been protecting the soldiers under their command. The base wasn't under attack. It was serving as a research facility where human lives were considered acceptable losses in service of studying things that should never have been allowed to exist. Patterson was probably already dead, his body joining the stacks of remains in that underground chamber. But his death, like all the others, served a purpose that went far beyond simple predation. He'd been murdered to feed an experiment that had been running for 70 years, funded by taxpayers who had no idea their sons and daughters were being used as food for creatures that existed in violation of everything we understood about the natural world. The truth was more horrible than I'd thought, and more dangerous than I'd prepared for. But it was also the key to ending this nightmare, if I could find a way to use it before becoming another casualty in the official records. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Patterson's face joining the stacks of corpses in that underground chamber, saw those pale creatures methodically butchering him with the same precision they'd used on Brooks and Hayes. The knowledge that this would continue happening, night after night, soldier after soldier, until someone finally stopped it made lying still impossible. The other soldiers had settled into their bunks with the casual exhaustion of people who'd survived another attack. Reed was already snoring softly, his rifle within arm's reach but his breathing steady and deep. These men had learned to compartmentalize the horror, to function within a system that treated their lives as acceptable losses in service of something they weren't supposed to understand. I couldn't make that accommodation anymore. The photographs on my phone proved what was happening, but evidence without action was worthless. Previous soldiers had documented everything for decades without changing anything. The journal Reed had shown me was filled with careful observations and detailed sketches, but none of that accumulated knowledge had saved a single life. The creatures were down there right now, probably beginning their work on Patterson's body. Tomorrow night, there would be another draw. More short straws, more soldiers delivered to that feeding chamber. The cycle would continue until someone broke it permanently, and that responsibility had fallen to me whether I wanted it or not. I slipped out of my bunk and gathered my gear, moving quietly to avoid waking anyone. My rifle still had a full magazine from the attack, and I loaded extra ammunition into every available pocket. If I was going back into those tunnels, I needed to be prepared for a fight that would either end this nightmare or add my name to the list of soldiers who died trying. The compound was settling into post-attack routines when I stepped outside. Damage assessment teams were looking at impact craters and checking equipment, while communications personnel worked to re-establish contact with higher command. The smoke provided perfect cover for my movement toward the keep, and nobody questioned a soldier carrying his weapon in the aftermath of a mortar bombardment. The concealed entrance was exactly where I'd left it, hidden behind deliberately placed rubble that couldn't fool careful examination. I squeezed through the narrow opening and found myself back in the tunnel system that housed decades of accumulated horror. The stench hit me immediately, decay, and that musky animal smell that seemed to cover every surface down here. My flashlight beam preceded me down the sloping passage, but I could already see the pale glow ahead that marked the feeding chamber. The creatures would be working on Patterson now, adding his remains to their organized collection of human corpses. The thought filled me with a rage that burned hotter than fear. I moved faster this time, no longer concerned with stealth. My boots rang off the stone walls as I descended toward the chamber, rifle ready, finger on the trigger. If the creatures wanted to continue their feeding operation, they'd have to go through me first. The chamber appeared exactly as I'd left it, but now 4 creatures worked among the corpses instead of 3. Patterson's body lay on the stone floor in the center of the space, already showing the precise incisions I'd seen on the other remains. The things moved with methodical efficiency, using tools that shined in the pale light emanating from their oversized eyes. One of them noticed my approach and abandoned its work, moving toward the tunnel entrance with that fluid, predatory gait. The others followed, converging on my position with obvious hostile intent. These weren't the curious, almost cautious creatures I'd encountered earlier. They moved with the focused aggression of predators defending their territory. I opened fire before they could close the distance, my first burst catching the lead creature center mass and spinning it around. The high-velocity rounds punched through its pale skin and dropped it to the stone floor, where it twitched once and went still. Dark blood spread beneath the corpse, looking black in the unnatural illumination. The other creatures didn't retreat this time. They separated and began flanking my position, moving with coordinated intelligence that confirmed every suspicion from the journal entries. These things weren't mindless predators. They were organized hunters with complex social structures and tactical awareness. I turned my aim to the creature approaching from my left, firing a controlled burst that sent it stumbling backward into the stacks of corpses. Old bones scattered across the floor as the thing collapsed, its glowing eyes dimming to nothing. The remaining two creatures paused, reassessing the threat I represented. From deeper in the tunnel system came a sound that made my blood freeze. Chittering voices bouncing off stone walls, growing louder as they approached. The gunfire had attracted attention from whatever lived in the passages beyond the feeding chamber. My intrusion wasn't just disturbing the creatures working here, it was agitating the entire underground colony. More pale shapes appeared at the far end of the chamber, emerging from passages I hadn't noticed during my first visit. Their eyes created pools of cold light in the darkness as they moved toward me with synchronized precision. I counted 6, then 8, then stopped counting as more continued appearing from the deeper tunnels. I backed toward the entrance while maintaining suppressive fire, my rifle spitting flame in the confined space. The bullets struck stone and flesh with equal effect, sending rock chips flying and dropping creatures that moved too slowly to avoid my aim. But for every one I killed, 2 more appeared from the labyrinth of passages that extended far beyond what I'd imagined. The chittering sounds were coming from multiple directions now, bouncing off the walls in a cacophony that suggested dozens of creatures converging on the feeding chamber. The noise grew louder with each passing second, punctuated by the scraping of claws against stone and the whisper of movement through narrow spaces. My magazine ran empty as I reached the tunnel entrance. I dropped it and slammed a fresh one home, chambering around while pale shapes flowed toward me across the chamber floor. The creatures moved like water finding its level, spreading out to surround my position while more emerged from every visible passage. I turned and ran up the sloping tunnel toward the surface, my boots pounding against stone as chittering voices pursued me through the darkness. The sound came from behind and ahead, suggesting the creatures knew alternate routes to the surface. They weren't just chasing me, they were attempting to cut off my escape. The tunnel mouth appeared ahead, showing the compound's emergency lighting beyond the concealed entrance. I squeezed through the narrow opening and emerged into the night air, immediately turning to aim back at the passage. If the creatures followed me to the surface, I'd make my stand here rather than lead them into the compound where other soldiers could be caught in the crossfire. But the expected pursuit never came. Instead, the chittering voices faded as the creatures retreated deeper into their tunnels, abandoning their chase at the boundary between their domain and the surface world. Something about leaving their underground territory seemed to restrain them, as if they were bound by rules I didn't understand. Behind me, a grinding sound filled the air like massive stones moving against each other. I turned to see the keep itself beginning to change, cracks appearing in the walls that had stood for centuries. Dust poured from the narrow window slits as the structure trembled on its foundation. The sound grew louder, becoming a deep rumble that seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than from the building itself. More cracks appeared, racing up the walls like lightning bolts as the entire structure began to lean at an impossible angle. The medieval stones that had been fitted together with master craftsmanship were separating, pulling apart, as if the foundation beneath them was collapsing. Within minutes, the keep was falling in on itself with heavy inevitability. Massive blocks crashed down into the center of the structure, creating an avalanche of stone that buried everything beneath in tons of rubble. The grinding sound reached a crescendo and then stopped abruptly, leaving only the settling noise of debris finding its final resting place. In the pile of broken stones, pale lights blinked briefly, the glowing eyes of creatures trapped beneath the collapse. The lights pulsed weakly for several seconds, growing dimmer with each beat, until they finally winked out and left only darkness. Whatever had lived beneath the keep was gone, crushed under the weight of its own home. I stood in the compound watching 7 centuries of history reduce itself to rubble, my rifle still smoking from the firefight below. The structure that had dominated this outpost since before any modern military existed was gone, leaving only a mound of broken stone where it had stood. The tunnel entrance I'd used was completely buried, sealing whatever remained of the underground complex behind tons of medieval masonry. Other soldiers began appearing from buildings around the compound, drawn by the sound of the collapse. They moved cautiously toward the rubble pile, weapons ready, expecting enemy action or some kind of attack. But their reactions weren't what I'd anticipated. Sergeant Torres emerged from the command post and walked directly to where I stood beside the ruins. His expression was professionally neutral as he looked at the destruction, showing no surprise or concern about the sudden disappearance of the base's most prominent feature. "Equipment check in 10 minutes, he announced to the gathered soldiers. "Make sure your gear survived the attack." That was it. No questions about how a very old stone keep had just collapsed. No investigation into what had caused the destruction. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. Torres treated the complete elimination of a centuries-old structure as if it were routine maintenance. The other soldiers went back to their assigned duties with the same casual acceptance. Reed walked past the rubble pile without a second look, heading toward his quarters as if nothing had changed. Williams and Patterson's replacement continued their post-attack procedures, checking equipment and preparing status reports that would make no mention of buildings falling down. I realized they were all acting as if the keep had never existed at all. Their behavior suggested that very old stone structures just collapsing during mortar attacks was completely normal, requiring no explanation or investigation. The willful blindness that had allowed them to function within this nightmare had expanded to include even the most dramatic evidence that something basic had changed. By morning, work crews had appeared with heavy equipment to clear away the rubble. They operated with the efficiency of a planned construction project rather than an emergency response, suggesting this outcome had been expected and prepared for. The stones were loaded onto trucks and hauled away, leaving only a patch of level ground where the keep had stood for 7 centuries. Nobody mentioned the destruction. Status reports made no reference to building changes. The morning briefing proceeded as if the most prominent feature of the base had never existed, and when new personnel arrived the following week, they were never told that anything had occupied the empty space at the compound's center. But the changes went deeper than official silence about the collapse. The oppressive atmosphere that had dominated the outpost lifted like fog clearing after sunrise. Soldiers walked with their heads up, made eye contact during conversations, and spoke in normal voices instead of whispers. The constant tension that had made everyone move like they were being watched simply disappeared. More importantly, the nighttime attacks stopped completely. The mortars that had provided cover for hunting expeditions never fell again, leaving our nights quiet except for the normal sounds of a military base conducting routine operations. Guard duty became actual security work instead of a death sentence, and soldiers could move freely around the compound after dark without fear of being dragged into underground chambers. The straw drawing system became unnecessary overnight. Torres announced that changing tactical conditions had eliminated the need for the special watch rotation, though he offered no explanation of what those changing conditions might be. The canvas-wrapped bundle of straws disappeared from his office, and evening briefings returned to standard operational updates instead of lottery drawings that determined who would live and who would die. Over my remaining weeks at the base, not a single soldier disappeared. The careful headcounts that had marked every morning since my arrival became routine administrative tasks instead of casualty reports. Names stopped vanishing from duty rosters, personal effects stopped disappearing from footlockers, and families stopped receiving folded flags with official condolences. Reed seemed like a different person without the constant weight of anticipated death hanging over him. His hollow-eyed exhaustion gradually lifted, replaced by something approaching normal military alertness. He still maintained careful habits developed over years of survival, but the desperate edge that had characterized his behavior began to fade. The motor pool, communications center, and ammunition depot returned to standard operational status instead of serving as hunting grounds for creatures that fed on soldiers. Equipment checks became routine maintenance instead of desperate preparations for survival. The base functioned like a normal military outpost for the first time in decades. I submitted my detailed report through official channels, documenting everything I'd discovered about the creatures, the feeding operation, and the military's complicity in maintaining a system that had deliberately sacrificed soldiers for 70 years. The report included the photographs I'd taken in the feeding chamber, GPS coordinates for the tunnel entrance, and a complete account of how the keep's destruction had ended the nightmare permanently. The report disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of military intelligence, classification reviews, and departmental transfers that characterized any sensitive information. I received a standard acknowledgement of receipt, but no follow-up questions or requests for additional details. The silence suggested that my discoveries had been forwarded to appropriate authorities who would ensure that similar situations never developed elsewhere. I rotated out of the base 6 weeks later, confident that my actions had finally broken a cycle of horror that had persisted for generations. The keep was gone, the creatures were dead, and the soldiers who remained could serve their deployments without fear of being systematically murdered to feed things that shouldn't have existed. The base would continue its strategic mission without requiring the blood sacrifice that had sustained it for 7 decades. No more names would be added to that hidden journal. No more families would wonder why their sons and daughters had really died. And no more soldiers would draw short straws that marked them for feeding to underground predators. I had ended the nightmare, and the official report would ensure that appropriate authorities understood exactly what had happened and how to prevent its recurrence. 5 years had passed since I'd last thought about Forward Operating Base Kandahar East. The nightmares had finally stopped coming around year 3, and I'd built a decent life for myself in Colorado Springs working construction management for a company that specialized in government contracts. The irony wasn't lost on me. Using my military experience to build things instead of destroying them felt like appropriate penance for what I'd witnessed overseas. My house sat on 2 acres outside the city, far enough from neighbors that I could work on my truck in peace, and close enough to town that the commute didn't eat my entire day. The mortgage was manageable, the work was steady, and most importantly, nobody asked questions about my deployment history or why I'd chosen to live somewhere I could see every approach to my property from the kitchen window. I was replacing brake pads on my Ford when the black sedan pulled into my driveway. The car was too clean, too expensive, and too deliberately nondescript to belong to anyone I knew. Government plates would have been obvious, but civilian plates on a vehicle that screamed federal agent were somehow more unsettling. The man who stepped out wore a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. He moved with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to authority, though his soft hands and perfect posture suggested office work rather than field experience. His age put him somewhere in his late 40s, with graying temples and the kind of face that disappeared in crowds despite being completely unremarkable. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and walked toward him, keeping my distance but maintaining eye contact. Years of civilian life hadn't erased the habits I'd developed overseas. Always know who's approaching your position and why they're there. James Mitchell, his voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered difficult news for a living. Depends on who's asking. He reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out a leather wallet that he opened to show federal identification. The badge looked real, though the agency name was covered by his thumb. Robert Hayes, Department of National Security Research. I'd like to speak with you about your service in Afghanistan. The name hit me hard. Hayes. Brandon Hayes had been one of the soldiers who disappeared into those tunnels, his body stacked in that underground chamber alongside Brooks and Clark. The coincidence seemed impossible, but the other explanations were worse. I did my deployment and came home. Not much to discuss. Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside. What I have to share is sensitive in nature. Every instinct told me to refuse, to send this man away and pretend the conversation had never happened. But the name Hayes and his knowledge of my deployment meant this visit had been coming from the moment I'd submitted that report 5 years ago. Whatever he wanted to discuss had been building toward this moment for half a decade. I led him through the front door and into my living room, pointing toward the couch while I remained standing near the kitchen doorway. The position gave me multiple exit routes and kept him in clear view. Habits that felt paranoid until situations like this proved their value. Hayes sat down on the cushions with the ease of someone comfortable in unfamiliar environments. He smoothed his tie and pulled out a manila folder from his briefcase, placing it on the coffee table between us like an offering. First, let me express my gratitude for your service at Forward Operating Base Kandahar East. Your actions during that deployment showed exceptional courage under extraordinary circumstances. I did my job, same as everyone else stationed there. I don't think that's entirely accurate. He opened the folder and removed a thick document that I recognized immediately. My detailed report about the keep, the creatures, and the decades of systematic murder that had masqueraded as combat casualties. Your report makes for fascinating reading, Mr. Mitchell. Very thorough, very detailed, very explosive in its implications. The sight of that report made my stomach clench. I'd sent it through proper channels, expecting the right people would investigate and stop similar situations from happening elsewhere. Seeing it in the hands of a federal agent 5 years later suggested the system had worked exactly as planned, though not in ways I'd expected. Then you know what happened there. You know soldiers were being murdered to feed those things. Hayes nodded with the same professional detachment he might show while reviewing weather reports. Oh yes, we're quite aware of the situation at the outpost. Have been for decades, actually. Your report simply provided confirmation of operational details we'd suspected but couldn't verify. The casual admission hit me harder than I'd expected. You knew soldiers were being killed and you let it continue. The facility served important research purposes, Mr. Mitchell. The entities you encountered represented a unique opportunity to study biological anomalies that don't exist anywhere else on Earth. The strategic value of that research outweighed the unfortunate casualties required to maintain the operation. He spoke about human lives like they were acceptable losses in a budget calculation, his tone never changing from polite professionalism. The soldiers I'd watched disappear, the corpses I'd found stacked in that underground chamber, the decades of families who'd received folded flags instead of answers. All of it reduced to footnotes in a research project. How many? My voice came out rougher than I'd intended. How many soldiers died to feed your research project? Hayes checked a page in the folder like someone looking up information they used all the time. About 430 over the 70-year period. The death rate stayed manageable at roughly 6 soldiers per year, well within acceptable limits for a facility of that type. 430 people, young men and women who'd volunteered to serve their country, who'd trusted their commanders to use their lives for real military purposes. Instead, they'd been systematically delivered to creatures that treated them like livestock in service of research that valued scientific curiosity over human survival. The families never knew the truth. Of course not. Operational security required maintaining the cover story of combat casualties. The families received appropriate compensation and honors for their loved ones' service. From their perspective, their sons and daughters died serving their country, which is technically accurate. The cold calculation behind his words made my hands shake. These people had sacrificed everything they had to give while bureaucrats like Hayes filed their deaths under acceptable losses and moved on to the next budget cycle. The way they systematically betrayed everyone was worse than the creatures themselves. My report recommended investigating similar facilities and preventing this from happening elsewhere. Hayes smiled with what might have been real amusement. Your report was never forwarded up the chain of command, Mr. Mitchell. It was classified immediately upon receipt and transferred to my department for evaluation. The contents were far too sensitive for normal military channels. The news hit me hard. For 5 years, I'd believed my actions had prevented other soldiers from suffering the same fate as those I'd found in that feeding chamber. I'd thought my detailed documentation would ensure that appropriate authorities understood the scope of the problem and took steps to address it system-wide. Instead, my report had been buried in the same classification process that had hidden the truth for 70 years. Nothing had changed except that one facility had been eliminated while the bureaucratic infrastructure that had enabled it remained intact. Yes, that was unexpected. Hayes consulted another page in the folder, his expression showing mild annoyance rather than satisfaction. Our research teams had been unable to neutralize the entities despite years of study. Your direct action approach succeeded where our scientists had failed, which raised interesting questions about methodology and approach. He discussed the destruction of an ancient evil that had consumed hundreds of lives like it was a minor inconvenience in his research schedule. The creatures that had terrorized soldiers for generations were reduced to failed experiments that had been terminated through unauthorized intervention. The tunnel complex collapse was quite thorough, he continued. Eliminated the entire colony and sealed the access points permanently. Our geological surveys confirm that the threat has been neutralized and won't reconstitute. So it's over. That particular facility, yes. Though I should mention that your actions, while effective, were technically unauthorized and violated several military regulations regarding classified operations. The threat hid beneath his polite words. I destroyed something that had been killing soldiers for decades, ended a nightmare that had cost hundreds of lives, and wiped out creatures that existed in violation of everything we understood about biology. My reward was confirmation that I'd technically committed a crime. Hayes reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope, thick enough to contain substantial documentation. He placed it on the coffee table next to my report with the same careful precision he'd shown throughout our conversation. This contains $50,000 in cash, Mr. Mitchell. Consider it compensation for your discretionary service beyond normal military duties. The funds are untraceable and require no tax reporting, given their classification as a national security disbursement. The envelope sat between us like evidence of a transaction I hadn't agreed to participate in. Blood money for services rendered in getting rid of a problem that should never have existed in the first place. Payment for keeping quiet about crimes that had been committed by people who were supposed to protect the soldiers under their command. I don't want your money. Nevertheless, it's yours, along with our gratitude for resolving a situation that had persisted far longer than anyone anticipated. Hayes closed the folder and returned it to his briefcase with efficient movements. The research data you provided has proven invaluable for our ongoing projects in similar fields. The casual mention of ongoing projects made me freeze up. Other facilities existed. Other bases where soldiers were being delivered to things that shouldn't exist. My destruction of one site hadn't ended the nightmare. It had simply provided data for refining the process elsewhere. How many other sites? Hayes stood and straightened his jacket, getting ready to leave with the same professional style he'd shown throughout our conversation. That information falls well outside your security clearance, Mr. Mitchell. What I can tell you is that your actions have helped our understanding of containment protocols and entity neutralization procedures. He walked toward the door, pausing only to deliver his final message. I should mention that discussing the contents of our conversation with unauthorized personnel would violate national security laws carrying severe penalties. The classification level involved ensures that any disclosure would result in immediate prosecution under espionage statutes. The threat was delivered with the same polite professionalism he'd maintained throughout our meeting, wrapped in bureaucratic language that couldn't hide its essential nature. Keep quiet, or face federal prosecution for revealing crimes that had been sanctioned at the highest levels of government. Your service record reflects an honorable discharge and commendable performance during your deployment. That record would be unfortunately affected by any security violations that might occur in the future. Hayes opened the front door and stepped onto my porch, turning back only to offer a final comment. "Enjoy your retirement, Mr. Mitchell. You've earned it." The black sedan pulled out of my driveway with the same careful smoothness it had shown when it arrived, leaving only tire tracks in the gravel and the manila envelope on my coffee table. I watched until the car went around the bend, then stood in my doorway for another 10 minutes, making sure it wasn't coming back. The envelope had exactly what Hayes had promised: $50,000 in cash, untraceable bills in different amounts that could have come from anywhere, blood money for destroying something that had been killing soldiers for generations, payment for getting rid of a problem that had been kept around on purpose for research. I sat in my living room looking at the money and trying to process what I'd learned. My report had never been sent through proper channels. The government had known about the creatures for decades and had kept the base as a feeding station for research. 430 soldiers had died to satisfy scientific curiosity about biological things that existed outside normal classification systems. The families who'd gotten folded flags and official condolences had no idea their loved ones had been murdered to feed creatures that were being studied by federal agencies. The combat casualties that filled military records were actually planned killings designed to keep a research facility running that treated human lives as acceptable losses. Hayes had told me that other facilities existed, other places where soldiers were being delivered to things that shouldn't exist. My destruction of one site had given data for improving operations elsewhere, making me part of a system I'd thought I was tearing down. Hundreds of soldiers had died before I'd arrived at the base, and more would die at other facilities while researchers studied their deaths for insights into biological things. The nightmare I'd thought I'd ended was actually a small part of a larger program that kept operating with government approval. The money sat on my table, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to accept. Taking it would make me a paid participant in crimes that went against everything I'd sworn to protect when I'd enlisted. Refusing it wouldn't change anything that had happened or prevent what was happening elsewhere, but it might preserve something important about who I was supposed to be. Outside my window, Colorado stretched toward mountains that had existed for millions of years, without requiring human sacrifice to stay where they were. The normalcy of my civilian life felt fragile and temporary, built on the assumption that the worst things I'd seen overseas had been unusual rather than standard operating procedures. Hayes had destroyed that assumption with professional efficiency, showing that the government I'd served had been deliberately murdering soldiers for decades in service of research projects that treated human lives as laboratory supplies. The planned nature of the betrayal was worse than anything the creatures had done, because it had been organized and carried out by people who were supposed to protect the soldiers under their command. 430 soldiers over 70 years, names that had been crossed off duty rosters, personal effects that had been shipped home to grieving families, flags that had been folded with military precision while the truth rotted in underground chambers. All of it approved, all of it classified, all of it continuing at other facilities, while researchers gathered data about biological things. The envelope of cash represented more than payment for services. It was proof that I'd become part of a system that measured human lives in budget allocations and research objectives. Taking the money would make me part of crimes I couldn't prevent, while refusing it would accomplish nothing except keeping the illusion that my hands were clean. I thought about Brandon Hayes, whose name the federal agent shared, whose body I'd found stacked in that underground chamber. The coincidence seemed too perfect to be accidental, suggesting that Robert Hayes had personal as well as professional reasons for making this visit. Perhaps he'd lost a relative to the creatures, or perhaps he was simply using a familiar name to make our conversation more pointed. Either way, his message had been delivered with clear intent. The nightmare I'd seen was part of a larger program that kept operating with government approval. Other soldiers were dying at other facilities while researchers studied their deaths for insights into things that existed outside normal classification systems. My actions had given data for improving those operations rather than ending them. The knowledge that hundreds of people had been deliberately sacrificed to feed creatures being studied for research made me part of a system I couldn't expose without violating national security laws. Speaking publicly about what I'd learned would result in federal prosecution, while staying silent would allow the program to continue operating elsewhere. I was trapped between being part of it and being a criminal, forced to carry knowledge that made me an accessory to ongoing crimes I couldn't prevent or expose. The soldiers dying at other facilities would never know that someone had tried to end their nightmare, just as the families getting folded flags would never know their loved ones had been murdered for research. I would carry that knowledge for the rest of my life, making every normal civilian moment feel like borrowed time built on a foundation of planned betrayal. Hayes had given me money and threats in equal measure, making sure that I understood both the value of my silence and the consequences of breaking it. 430 soldiers had died to feed creatures that were being studied by government agencies. More were dying at other facilities while I sat in my living room holding blood money and trying to rationalize my part in crimes that kept happening because people like me chose silence over exposure. The manila envelope sat on my coffee table like evidence of a transaction that made me part of a system I'd thought I was fighting against. Taking the money or refusing it wouldn't change what had happened or prevent what was happening elsewhere, but it would determine what kind of person I became in the aftermath of learning the truth.